Uju Sego. My name is April Lindala, and I am coming to you from Anishinaabe territory in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. I work at Northern Michigan University in the Native American Studies Department. I am currently working on a PhD at Michigan Technological University, and my area of study is Indigenous documentary. I'm very curious to see how Indigenous documentary can empower Indigenous nations and people, educate Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And so my presentation is entitled Restoring, as there's a little bit of a trick word in there because there's a Y instead of just restoring Indigenous ways of being on screen for cinema documentary. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and begin. I'm going to do my best to be mindful of my time limit. Kathleen Epsilon suggests that to remember who we are and where we come from as Anishinaabe is an act of resistance against being dismembered. Epsilon's model of practice to look again, to research, to rewrite, to re-story is an act of assembling oneself back together to make whole. This is an act of survivance. My journey in the practice of relooking involves the act of viewing documentary films and to demonstrate that Indigenous visual storytelling can serve as empowering acts of resistance to cognitive imperialism put upon us through structures such as education and the media. I offer that forced cinema documentaries require a closer look in order to restory and reprioritize Indigenous knowledges and stories. According to Leroy Littlebear, storytelling is a vital aspect of education. He states it is through stories that customs and values are taught and shared. Stories from many Indigenous groups reflect the rules of natural law and the values of the natural world. Indigenous stories also have the potential to reveal the consequences of nation states and their lack of action in relation to the one earth that we all share. Brian Brayboy suggests that Indigenous stories operate as theories. He offers stories and other media are roadmaps for our communities and reminders to our individual responsibilities to the survival of our communities. Indigenous documentarians in this case have the potential to be distinct artists, actors, activists, educators, who, through their films, are able to cut through mainstream society's hegemonic, perpetual erasure of Indigenous peoples and continual dismissal of Indigenous ways of knowing. Such acts embody what Gerald Visner describes as acts of survivance. These filmic expressions may sharply counter ongoing historical amnesia and subsequent cognitive imperialism. Carl Kroeber explains how Visner employs the term survivance. Visner uses survivance to subordinate survival's implications of escape from catastrophe and marginal preservation. He seizes on survivance's oldest sense of succession, orienting its connotation not toward loss, but renewal and continuity in the future. This concept of succession aligns with Indigenous teachings about the need to look towards the next 7 generations. Consider this: for every thought and action you embark on today, you must think of the impact of your grandchildren's grandchildren. Considering that nation states impose considerably harsh conditions in an attempt to terminate Indigenous peoples, I respectfully offer that 7 generations thinking, survivance as succession thinking ignites hope and strength for Indigenous communities. Survivance is one answer to the term cognitive imperialism. Marie Batiste defines the term as a form of cognitive manipulation used to disclaim other knowledge bases and values. Batiste articulated that we have all been marinated in Eurocentrism, the macro ultra-dominant theory that positions itself in an all-knowing and superior center. James Youngblood Henderson explains that Eurocentrism is the intellectual tool of European colonialism. It is this tool that leads to the dismembering that Kathleen Epsilon speaks of in her writings. Brayboy suggests that this tool has been successful. He states many American Indians fail to recognize that we are taking up colonialist ideas when we fail to express ourselves in ways that may challenge dominant societies about who and what we are supposed to be and how we are supposed to behave and what we are supposed to be within the larger population. As a response to what may appear to be his disheartening statement, Batiste contends that we, Indigenous peoples, must be critical change agents and healers. Batiste's writings are aligned with how film and media can operate as public pedagogy, and I contend that Indigenous documentary filmmakers are taking on the vital agency building work through their art. I will rely on 2 Indigenous research approaches, tribal critical race theory from Brayboy and Native feminist theories from Arnville et al. Brayboy explains that tribal critical race theory, shortened to tribal crit, offers an analytical lens and a new and more culturally nuanced way of examining the lives and experiences of tribal peoples since contact with Europeans. The theory provides a, quote, lens for addressing many of the issues facing American Indian communities today, including issues of language shift, language loss, and natural resources management, among other concerns. Brayboy further explains that tribal crit explicitly rejects the call for assimilation in educational institutions, for American Indian students. Let me read that sentence again. Brayboy further explains that tribal crit explicitly rejects the call for assimilation in educational institutions for American Indian students. However, he adds that tribal crit might also teach American students how to combine Indigenous knowledge of culture and power with Western European conceptions in order to actively engage in survivance, self-determination, and tribal autonomy. Brayboy's objective is to improve the situation for American Indian students in educational systems such as colleges and universities. Many tribal nations and Indigenous groups also recognize the decision-making contribution of Indigenous women. Native feminist theories thus complements Brayboy's theoretical offerings. Arvin et al. Discusses the complications with 2 intertwined ideas that are firmly placed within the walls of cognitive imperialism that do not easily allow for intersectional crossings. These ideas are, first, many Western countries are settler colonial nation states, and second, settler colonialism has been and continues to be a gendered process. In their argument, the authors assert that settler colonialism is a structure and not an event that continues to shape the everyday lives of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. Parallel to other scholars who discussed intersectionality, the difference and distinction here is that these are not limited to racialized peoples. Both of these theoretical contributions build arguments that counter cognitive imperialism, as well as mold complementary approaches in research practices and creative expressions to advance survivance. Both approaches offer a much more thorough discussion than what I can offer here. The origin of fourth story begins with the introduction of the fourth world concept. Dorothy Christian shares that First Nations activist George Manuel named the indigenous reality in colonizer nation states as the fourth world, and the name has since been used within political discourse. Barry Barclay, Maori, coined the term fourth cinema to differentiate films that actively reflect the experience of Indigenous peoples, communities, and cultures. Fourth cinema reflects practices that give attention to Indigenous representation through strategies that reinforce cinematic sovereignty. In other words, Indigenous peoples' right to make their own decisions in how they will be represented in a film. I will speak to two representational strategies: community participation and the inclusion of Indigenous language. I believe these align with the above-mentioned theoretical approaches, contribute to countering cognitive imperialism, and furthering survivance. But this is only a start of a list of strategies. It's only an entry point. It is not an exhaustive list. With regards to community participation, noted Abenaki filmmaker Eleni Sobamsoen discussed in a 2019 interview that she first records participants with an audio recorder and then moves to video once the person is comfortable with her and her equipment. This gesture reflects a careful approach to community inquiry in order for the equipment to be seen as a fitting companion within a comfortable space, as opposed to an object of investigation or observation. Community participation also means a witnessing of multi-generational voices. The filmmaker may have an opportunity to interview an elder matriarch, but for her to feel confident in her message, the filmmaker may need to navigate two grandchildren who sit on her lap. This also will provide comfort as well as distance to the camera while simultaneously representing multiple generations. Community in the Indigenous lens requires acknowledgement of community members in the broad scope, including land, water, and all beings of creation. Many Indigenous languages around the globe are endangered or near extinction. When viable, inclusion of spoken or written language promotes representational strategy that reinforces presence, both the visibly and the orally. Batiste discusses that languages are critical to the survival of the culture and political integrity of any people. Indigenous languages are not only about a way of community, but a way of thinking. Such inclusion, again, counters cognitive imperialism. But sadly, Indigenous languages are threatened, so representation of language may not always be an option for the filmmaker. The following is a very brief examination of two films, Nepawis Tamasoen, We Will Stand Up, and Angry Inuk, where I seek to underscore the theoretical approaches and fourth cinema strategies mentioned above. In the opening scene of Nepawis Tamasoen, We Will Stand Up, director and narrator Tasha Hubbard is walking with her son and nephew in a large field. We see on screen an extreme close-up of a barbed wire fence. Hubbard lifts and separates the wires for the boys to climb through. The barbed wire fence may serve as a visual metaphor, the parent attempting to create a safe opening for the child to get through thorny situations that could harm him. Hubbard soon introduces the audience to the family of Colton Bushy, as well as recount the story of Colton's murder in the Treaty 6 territory of Saskatchewan. Hubbard soon admits she cannot always protect her son and nephew from dangers in the world. The tension within the film's narrative centers on the acquittal of Gerald Stanley, a white farmer who shot Colton in the head. The film follows the family ordeal, working closely with Colton's family during a time of grief, reflects a careful navigation of the director to ensure that the story is not only properly represented, but that the process doesn't bring about further distress to participating family members. Hubbard's actions are particularly mindful because she learns that her father's wife is related to Colton's family. Another careful navigation is presented through illustration and animation. Hubbard creates space for ancestors to be seen as she tells the story of Cree leaders of the plains who struggled with starvation in the late 1800s and the hanging of 8 Cree leaders in 1885. This historical narrative and Hubbard's voice over thoughtfully explains the conditions of which the Cree were treated by colonial settlers. Hubbard explains her motivation with the animation. The animation comes in when I am narrating the sections about this Cree history, and I approach it as if I am telling the story to my 12-year-old son and nephew. Hubbard's attention to her son and nephew afford her a careful decision-making strategy that reflects the actions of 7-generation survivant succession thinking. Alethea Arnacook Baril also dedicated a significant amount of screen time in Angry Inuk to provide historical context through interviews as well as animation. She notes that filmmakers from dominant cultures don't have the burden of teaching audiences about the entire history and traumas of their culture as a starting point before telling their story. The filmmaker employs the strategy of community and intergenerational connectedness as well as inclusion of Indigenous language. In an early scene, we see a group of Inuit sitting on a living room floor using their ulu to cut up seal meat. Another scene shortly after features elder Inuit women sitting on the floor and softening hides with their teeth. Conversations are held in the Inuk language. These relaxed community gatherings showcase family and community. The seal hunt is both a necessity as a primary food source, but also a means of celebration. The narrative explains that there are approximately 32,000 Inuit, and they are fighting for their livelihood against the European Union that voted on a seal ban that significantly impacted sales of seal skin in the commercial market. The director narrates almost autobiographically, sharing details of her own life, but she also serves as a guide to introduce viewers to the Inuit community. She speaks to an older hunter who was around for the 1983 seal hunting ban, which the director describes as the Inuits' Great Depression. This hunter speaks for several minutes only in the Inuk language. Excuse me for if I get her name wrong. Arnacook Baril sidesteps off of the screen, giving this elder due respect of his age and experience. In the second half of the film, viewers will notice a switch from the community elders to Alethea, the director, and her friend Ayu, as they meet with Inuit political science students from Ottawa. These students raise money to travel to Europe to bring awareness of how the Inuits' economy has been devastated with the EU ban. The filmmaker comments, in this huge and globally interconnected world, we as Inuit have to be more willing to translate our anger and be willing to be a bit more confrontational. It's a fine line to speak more loudly and still be true to ourselves and our principles, but it's possible. Aletha and Ayu are mentoring the young people in how to prepare to speak to EU delegates, as well as show them how to protest on a busy street in Toronto. This type of teaching of activism is representative of survivance and succession and speaks to the strengthening of Indigenous students' education, as well as linkages to the generations following in the footsteps of the adults. In closing, these two examples of forced cinema filmmaking address Indigenous stories with care and integrity. The films are constructed in a quality fashion that will render them cinematic and educational treasures for years to come. These documentaries provide a significant platform to represent the story of Indigenous individuals and communities. The filmmaker's thoughtful and meaningful strategies reflect the inclusion of Indigenous languages, in addition to giving voice to multiple genders, multiple generations of Indigenous community members. Such strategies fortify a sense of survivance and succession through seventh-generation thinking that embodies emergent theoretical approaches, such as tribal critical race theory and native feminist theories. The director of the Indigenous Screen Office in Canada, Jesse Wente, stated in an interview about the emergence of Indigenous-made films in recent years, "This is about us being human. There are real pressing issues in our community that require that Canada see us as human if they're ever going to be addressed. Art is one pathway to create those human connections." Both documentaries seek to educate viewers about distinct locale distresses, but each one of the films also address broader societal consequences for the global audience. Overall, Indigenous directed, Indigenous produced documentaries have the potential to restore a dignified sense of self and create a swell of community resurgence. Fourth Cinema Documentary may be one vehicle to artfully present stories of survivance and offer hope to Indigenous nations collectively worldwide. Thank you very much.